in the SI Hayakawa race. I've been involved in many major campaigns here in California for a number of years.
Eileen Padberg, Regional Political Director with the George Bush for President campaign. Thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome.
Up next on C-SPAN, a look at the most recent entrant in the 1988 presidential campaign. This week, former Senator Eugene McCarthy threw his hat in the race as the Consumer Party candidate. He made his announcement in Philadelphia.
Ladies and gentlemen, former Senator Eugene McCarthy. Thank you very much, Lance, for the introduction and the definition of what our purpose is. I've been asked by some of the early press people why I was running here as the candidate of the Consumer Party, and I've given them three reasons. One was that the party asked me to run. The second is I think there's a need for a third-party candidacy in this country in 1988. And thirdly, I look upon this party as one that has structure and function, which is a part of really the framework of American politics, and we can build on it here in this state and build with other third-party movements in other parts of the country. I hesitate to even begin to explain to you why we need some other kind of political action different from that which we're being offered by the Republicans and the Democrats. I've sort of been saying this ever since 1968, when we faced the very difficult proposition that neither one of the two major parties was going to give the people of this country a chance to make a judgment on the war in Vietnam. And the Johnson withdrawal from the race put him in a position to control the Democratic Party so that it went on record for the war and made it their war, and Nixon could then say, well, it's the Democrats' war, and run for it without taking responsibility for it. So in a way, we've been the government in exile, the responsible government in exile since 1968, and it seems to me that now, 1988, 20 years later, the time has come to again challenge the two political parties and to do it within the framework of a third-party movement. I was pleased to know I could make the announcement here at Independence Hall. I think the overall condition of the country now is really one of our having been reduced to a colonial status. We no longer have the kind of sovereign independence and opportunity to exercise responsible leadership in the world that we had in 1945 and 48 and 1960 up until the Vietnam War. We have all the marks of classical colonialism. We no longer determine our own foreign policy. We talked about Vietnam and said, well, we're in here because of a treaty, or we're in here because of a doctrine, or we're here because some other president was for it. But to stand off and say, let's make an objective historical judgment about it, they said, oh no, you can't do that. You break the line of continuity. In a way, very little different from the state of the colonies here back in 1776, when the British said, our foreign policy is your foreign policy. We've been reduced to colonial status with reference to our economy. We no longer control our money. The picture of the American government going to the Germans and the Japanese saying, help us bail out the dollar, is something that I thought we would never see. We're exporting raw materials and importing manufacturers. The American Revolution had to do with reversing that trend. They said, look, we don't want to consume what you tell us to consume. We want to consume what we produce. We want to decide what we're going to produce. The colonial dependency was further manifested in lack of control over borders. The British said, look, we'll send prisoners to your country, we'll send anything we want, and you have nothing to do about it. Our borders are no longer safe and protected, and our culture is endangered in a way that culture was imposed upon us and on other colonies by the British and other colonial powers. So in the year 1988, the basic question is whether or not we're going to establish America again as an independent historical force, politically, economically, and culturally. And you can't do it, in my judgment, through the instrumentality of the Republicans and the Democratic parties. It was not so bad when the Democrats were the party of initiative and of original thought. The Civil Rights Act and the civil rights position in '48, which was announced here in Philadelphia, was the kind of thing you expected from the Democrats. In 1968, we expected the Democrats to do something about the war in Vietnam, but they turned it aside. And since that time, they've been reduced to kind of a residual function, one usually reserved to the Republicans, of sort of second-guessing the Democrats. The Democrats are now second-guessing the Republicans. And if any initiative is to be provided, if any leadership, any new direction given to this country, in my opinion, it has to come through an independent kind of political movement, through a third-party movement, such as we initiate here in Philadelphia today. And I quite willingly offer myself as a candidate or as one of the persons who will be involved in that. I don't look upon it as my movement, but it's a kind of popular movement that was manifest here 200 years ago, and the time has come for another declaration, I suppose, of independence and of independent political action. The American Revolution was not the product of a two-party system. It was the product of independent decisions to take political action. The colonial leaders didn't go to King George and say, look, we want to have a revolution, will you give us some matching funds? And we'll run it either through the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. And when Jefferson wrote the Declaration and said, we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, he didn't consult with Common Cause to say, well, why don't you change that to our lives, our sacred honor, and up to $1,000 apiece. There was a different spirit, a different purpose, a different mode of operation, and that's what we hope to restore here in this country, starting here in Philadelphia today in 1988.
You expect to lose, though. You're just
no, I don't.
Issues.
Well, I didn't say I expect to lose at all. No, I mean, I suppose if you pressured Thomas Jefferson, you could have said, you don't expect to win this revolution, do you? You say, well, why don't you quit? We expect to have a significant impact on the politics of this country in 1988.
But this is a party that couldn't even elect the city councilman in its home city.
Well, that's all right. Maybe they should have gone national. Maybe they're not a local party. We're moving them out of that status now. They set their sights too close to home.
What is your Senator, what's wrong with Dukakis? What's wrong with Dukakis and Bush?
Well, that's a big story. It'll take us some time to explain it, but they're trying to explain each other and tell you what's wrong with them. I'd like to oversimplify, but I wrote a piece for the New Republic about a year ago saying that there are certain categories of politicians who don't make good presidents. One are governors. Second are vice presidents and former vice presidents. And the third are ministers. So they're now reduced to offering people from the same three categories, which I said were least acceptable to me.
Senator, you run for three different parties now.
Well, we don't have real strategy. Our effort is going to be to get on the ballot in as many states as we can and wait for the Republicans and Democrats to finish their convention and then to face them on the issues. But the summer months will be dedicated to getting on the ballot, and that's not easy.
Senator, you run for three different parties now, the Consumer Party, the Democratic Party, and the Independent in 76. Do you think that your personal goal in terms of becoming president supersedes your party loyalty?
Well, Abraham Lincoln did the same thing. He only ran as a Republican once. So it's no problem. Yeah, that's right. And actually in the last century, this party identification was not very strong. This is one of the things the two parties have done to us. They've made us think that if you're not a Republican or a Democrat, that you're somehow an American. Whereas people like Madison said the worst thing you could have in this republic was to have politics controlled by two strong factions. So if you go back to Madison, he would say this is the worst possible situation, and they're making it worse every year.
Senator, you know what it takes to win. You're a U.S. Senator, you ran for the presidency in '68. How can you possibly win on the Consumer Party ticket as president?
Well, they said I couldn't win on the Democratic ticket, so I can't do any worse on the consumer ticket than I did on the Democratic ticket.
Have a vice president,
but you really believe you can win?
We'll have a variety of vice presidents, probably different ones in different states.
Who is going to be it for Pennsylvania?
If we've got one chosen here yet, or that happens to be
The candidate for vice president running on the consumer ticket is Mrs. Florence Rice. She is she's the founder of the Harlem Consumer Education Council, one of the oldest grassroots consumer leaders in the country.
But we may have different vice presidential candidates in different states, and even different presidential candidates. So you're also hooked in the mode of the Republican and Democratic parties that you don't really know the traditions of the country or the thought that went into the Constitution.
You say how would you go about reducing this colonial dependency?
Well, the first thing you do is reject the idea that we have to conduct a foreign policy according to the dictates of John Foster Dulles. And you don't have to conduct a foreign policy because of a resolution that was adopted in the Johnson administration. Or you don't have to carry on a foreign policy in the way that Johnson said he had to go into Vietnam because he said 3 presidents before him were for it. And Nixon said he was doing it because 4 presidents had been for it.
What about economic policy?
Well, I was on the Finance and Ways and Means Committees for 16 years, and in that period, 22 years I was in Congress, the national debt rose $120 billion in 22 years. Now it goes up that much in about 6 months.
Senator, are you
So I'll pit my economic record and my proposals against anything that Dukakis or Bush or the Republicans or the Democrats can offer.
Mr. Odom, would you talk about the quality of the debate and the candidates that have come out of this process so far? Jackson, Dukakis, and Bush, have they been anywhere on the mark in your view in issues, or just classify them for me if you would, sir?
Well, Mr. Odom, I don't think the debate process is the way in which you sort out presidential candidates. You can't put 6 or 7 people up and say, now we're going to have a debate. If you really did this debate thing right in the showdown, because every presidential candidate says, my wife is going to have a great deal of influence on me, and my vice president. So what you really ought to do should have the president, Ronald should have debated with Nancy, instead of with Mondale. Mondale could have debated with his wife. Or you could have like tag wrestling. You could have the president and his wife and his vice president over here the other side, and one would jump in and argue and say, well, you go and you know that better than I do. But the debates are a distraction.
I assume the 3 candidates now left in are not turning you on at all with any kind of... What's your thoughts on it?
Well, I don't quite say that. I think that, for example, what Jesse is saying is maybe had to be said again, but it was in effect what should have been said in 1960. Because we had let the civil rights program lag after the 48 convention. And someone had to say, stir it up. We waited then for the riots and for Martin Luther King to come along. But I don't think it's what we have to be talking about now. We've had that. We've had Martin. We've had 20 years of kind of affirmative action since '64, which has accomplished about as much as you can get from kind of particularized affirmative action. We now have to look to the structural disorders in this society if we expect to have the ghettos eliminated and if we expect to have the minority unemployment problem in any way mitigated.
Senator, do you expect the campaign?
What's that?
Jackson, in your view, is not turning any new ground here.
No, that's right. But and I said, you know, you have to say this every so often, but I think the last time it had to be said was in '60 or '64, and that now you should be saying something else about how you deal with these problems.
You say the candidates are not addressing half a dozen issues. Could you enumerate some of those?
Yeah, actually, we got a kind of a handout here. Yes, one is the debt thing. I don't think they're addressing it properly. They're deploring it, but they're not dealing with it, and how to finance it, and how it got there. For example, you talk about the debt, you know, and the state of the economy. If the Democrats had been alert, they could have put a 25% tax on all securities last September before the market crash. They could have picked up the $1 trillion that was lost in the market crash, and the market wouldn't have known it had it. I mean, they'd been where they are now. They had $1 trillion or more of false value that they were trading on. Forget it. CBS thought they were worth $3 billion. Turner said, no, you're worth $6. We could have taken 3 from CBS. They wouldn't have known they had it.